everyone, my name's Andrew Pohl. I'm a Principal Product Manager for Amazon S3, and today I'm going to be telling you about how you can modernize your data archive with the Amazon S3 Glacier storage classes. We'll start by going over why an organization would want to archive data, as well as go over the benefits of archiving in the cloud. Then we'll talk about the storage classes available to you on S3 and how archival storage fits in. We'll then go over some ways you can save on your storage costs with archival storage, and finally, we'll review some customer use cases. So before we dive into the details, I want you to take a look at this slide and think about all of the industries represented here. There are many, many different companies within these industries with different use cases, different customers, and they're all saving data in different ways to do different things. But one thing that all of the companies have in common within these industries is that there are companies within them that are archiving data with AWS. For example, music and entertainment companies have large video files that over time are accessed less, oftentimes less than 4 times per year, after a period as little as 6 months after the content's created. And those companies are saving petabytes of data oftentimes, and they need a way to store this data in a cost-effective way. And that's a great archiving opportunity. Or, for example, companies in science and research are creating petabytes of data to do data analysis or storing data in a data lake for machine learning. However, again, after a period of time, the data is accessed less. And companies can save money by archiving this data and then spend that money on other things that really help their business. So while there are many different use cases across many different customers and industries, they all have archiving in common. And so there are really, while there are a lot of different use cases here, there's also 3 really that we see the most often. And those 3 are data retention, compliance, and disaster recovery. So first, there's data retention. And customers are building up petabytes of data, and they need somewhere to put it. They could be storing data for machine learning, as we mentioned. There might be photo and video content. Oftentimes, companies want to keep historical data in case they have an important use case for it later. But after a little while, it's likely that much of their data isn't being accessed more than once or twice per year. And that's an archiving opportunity. They can store their aging data and data sets they may want to use later to train models. And they can use AWS because they want their data to be available. Now, many of our customers also have compliance use cases, like financial services companies or healthcare companies, where they need to keep data around for a certain period of time. And if you're keeping data for 7 or even 10 years or longer, that's not going to be accessed more than 4 times per year, that's a great opportunity to save costs with archiving. And finally, many of our customers are archiving in AWS for disaster recovery. Customers use ISVs to store backups in archive. They're storing their own backups in S3 Glacier Flexible Retrieval. They might be creating virtual tapes using Tape Gateway, or they may be using cross-region replication to actually replicate data across regions for additional resiliency and redundancy. Customers love the flexibility that they have in AWS when deciding how to archive for disaster recovery. But while a lot of customers have used on-premises methodologies to store their archives, we find that they've seen a lot of challenges as well, and that's how they become AWS customers. And as many of you already know, archiving on-premises can be difficult. For example, companies have to deal with hosting. They're having to store data on multiple data centers. And as their data centers grow, it's becoming more and more complex to manage a global footprint. Companies that are using tape experience even more complex workflows where they have to manage temperature and humidity. And if they're storing tape off-site, they also are exposing themselves to risks of being able to get the data back and reconstitute it when they need it. And all of this requires additional resources or operating costs. And many companies saw an opportunity to move to AWS to lower the cost and complexity of their archival strategies and make it easier to monetize archives with adjacent AWS services. Now, one of the reasons that our customers love storing their archival data on Amazon S3 is that we offer a variety of storage classes for many different use cases, so that customers don't have to manage different hardware types to get cost-optimal storage. In fact, we offer 8 different storage classes within S3. Customers can optimize their cost in a variety of use cases. Our experience at AWS has really allowed us to innovate and reduce prices, adding more options as well. And archival storage has always been a part of this innovation, from the launch of Glacier in 2012 to Glacier Deep Archive in 2019, and most recently S3 Glacier Instant Retrieval in 2021. Customers that don't know their access pattern can also use S3 Intelligent Tiering with archival tiers that automatically reduce storage when objects aren't accessed. Glacier Instant Retrieval is also now a part of Intelligent Tiering as the Archive Instant Retrieval tier, giving customers the ability to save on storage costs with archive pricing while still maintaining millisecond access. So with Intelligent Tiering, customers are using cost-optimized archival storage even if their access pattern is unknown. But with 3 different archival storage classes, you might be wondering, how do I choose between the 3? All of Amazon S3's Glacier's storage classes are purpose-built for data archiving. We've got options for high performance with millisecond retrievals, flexible retrieval times when you don't need millisecond access, and we've got an option for the lowest storage cost in the cloud. Customers can also automatically reduce their costs with Intelligent Tiering. So before I share more about each of these storage classes, I want to spend some time on Glacier Instant Retrieval. Glacier Instant Retrieval is new, actually as of reInvent in 2021. Now, many customers stored rarely accessed data indefinitely, but they needed millisecond access. Think use cases like medical records and user-generated content. For example, with medical records, a customer might need to keep those around for years and years, as we discussed earlier. But think an example like an X-ray image, where a doctor and a patient may view it a couple times during the first week that it's generated, but then it's going to sit there for a long time, perhaps, and it won't be accessed. However, if they want to access it later, it still needs to be available in milliseconds, and that's where Glacier Instant Retrieval comes in. Or, in another example with user-generated content, such as photos and videos, companies often see less access of this data after a certain period of time. However, it's very important that when a customer goes and looks for their photo, that they can find it in milliseconds. They don't want to wait minutes to hours to see that. And that's, again, a use case for S3 Glacier Instant Retrieval. So we really encourage you to look for use cases where you might have rarely accessed long-lived data, because you might be able to save on your storage costs with S3 Glacier Instant Retrieval. Now, let's take a look at our 3 archival storage classes in more detail. So you can choose from 3 archival storage classes that are optimized for different duration. You've got immediate access, which we just discussed. You can choose S3 Glacier Instant Retrieval. And for workloads that don't require immediate access, but still need the flexibility to retrieve data in minutes to hours, or large data sets at no cost in hours, such as backup and recovery use cases, you can choose S3 Glacier Flexible Retrieval. And to save even more on long-lived data for use cases like media preservation and compliance, use S3 Glacier Deep Archive for the lowest cost in the cloud and retrieval within 12 hours. So while some objects might be cold on ingest, others likely have a falling access pattern over time, requiring less access than once per quarter. To save money on objects that predictably require less access over time, we offer lifecycle management. Now, using S3 storage class analysis, you can monitor your data access patterns and get recommendations for when you should lifecycle your data. Now, while the primary driver of when to lifecycle data is access pattern, object sizes and versioning can also affect your storage costs. In re:Invent in 2021, we announced new filters for lifecycle, which give customers the ability to choose objects based on object size and version to lifecycle. Well, first, for object size, we heard that customers often commingled large and small objects within the same bucket or prefix, but they only wanted to transition the large objects. For example, a customer might have small metadata files measured in kilobytes commingled with large 10 gigabyte media files. And they only want to transfer the 10 gigabyte files to S3 Glacier Deep Archive while keeping the metadata in a millisecond access storage class. For example, just to maintain access or to reduce the per object transition charges that they get from moving data to S3 Glacier Deep Archive. And we released the object size filter to help customers do that. Now, we also created a filter on the number of non-current versions for customers because they needed an easier way to control the costs of maintaining non-current versions. For example, a customer might want to keep 3 non-current versions in millisecond access while deleting the rest of their non-current versions. Or if they have a compliance use case or other need to hold on to older versions, they can move them to an archive storage class to save money on their storage. So now that I've shared with you some general examples of how customers can use these filters to save on their storage costs, I want to dive deeper into the lifecycle object size filter. When customers lifecycle data, for example, from S3 Standard to S3 Glacier Deep Archive, they reduce their monthly storage cost. And objects that are kept for a long time and that are rarely accessed are a great opportunity to do this. However, there's also a transition cost. And before a customer transitions data, we advise to make sure that you'll save enough money on your storage cost to offset that transition cost. Customers can compare the upfront cost of transition with their monthly savings to figure out a payback period. Or in other words, how long does it take to break even on the transition costs when storing data in S3 Glacier Deep Archive versus S3 Standard, or whatever storage class you're transitioning to. Now, I want to tell you about 2 key workload characteristics that affect your costs while transitioning data. But first, on the y-axis, you can see retention period, which is the amount of time you'll keep the data in the storage class you're transitioning to, in this case, S3 Glacier Deep Archive. And on the x-axis is object size, which is inversely proportional to your overall savings. And that's because smaller objects incur higher lifecycle costs with a given amount of data. So first, let's look at the lower left-hand quadrant. With small object sizes and a short retention period, you're highly unlikely to save money by transitioning data to S3 Glacier Deep Archive. And that's because the monthly savings just isn't likely to offset the high cost of transition. Now, as your retention gets longer, you're still unlikely to save, but if retention is 2 or more years, you could analyze whether moving your data makes sense. And in some use cases, it does, such as compliance. Now, as your objects get larger, that increases the chances of savings. If your retention period is short, but your objects are large, we still recommend doing an analysis to make sure that it makes sense to transition the data. However, if your objects are large and they're going to be in the S3 Glacier Deep Archive storage class for a long time, that's really an ideal use case for transition. And you can actually use S3 Storage Lens to identify buckets that are good candidates for transition, but still save money if you have a mix of object sizes with the object size filter. Now, let's look at an example of how you can use the object size filter to reduce your costs. In this example, a customer has 10 million small objects, around 40 kilobytes, 1 million medium-sized objects at 200 kilobytes, and 100,000 large objects at around 10 megabytes. If the customer were to transition all of this data, it would take 15 months to break even. Now, many customers also have compliance use cases where they need to keep data around for years and years, and in that case, this might make sense to transition all of this data. However, if it's only going to be 9 months to a year, transitioning all of this data won't break even. And that's where the object size filter comes in. Now, with the object size filter, we can filter out the smallest objects, transitioning only medium and large objects, which reduces the overall payback period to just 4 months if we're not transitioning those 40 kilobyte objects, which means now data only needs to be stored in Glacier Deep Archive for 4 months to save on storage costs. And if we take this a step further, we can filter out even the medium-sized objects. So if we filter out the 200 kilobyte objects, we now break even in just 2 months. A simple rule that you can use before you go and analyze all your buckets and prefixes is that a filter of 128 kilobytes will typically save you money on your overall storage spend. So with the object size filter and versioning control, we've given customers a wider set of tools to optimize their costs when storage has known access patterns. However, what if you don't know what your access pattern will be? Well, AWS can still help you optimize your storage costs. So to archive data with changing access patterns, we recommend using S3 Intelligent Tiering. With S3 Intelligent Tiering, you can take advantage of the low cost of archival storage with archive tiers. And it automatically optimizes your costs, saving you time. In cases where subsets of data are rarely accessed without the need for millisecond access, you can even use the archive and deep archive access tiers to save even more on your storage costs. For example, many customers with data lakes used for internal ad hoc analysis or machine learning may not need to access this data for months or even longer. And it doesn't need immediate access when it's retrieved. For use cases like that, they can use the archive and deep archive access tiers to save money on the storage, but still get access to it when they need it without paying for retrieval costs. In addition, since reInvent, S3 Glacier Instant Retrieval, or the Instant Retrieval Access tier, is automatically applied after just 90 days. So customers can now archive with millisecond access, getting the low cost of archival storage and automatic cost savings. Now, I mentioned earlier that there are companies from every industry using AWS to archive their data. And I want to take you through a few examples, one from the financial services industry and one from media and entertainment. So the first customer I'm going to tell you about is Capital One. Now, Capital One believed that technology was going to revolutionize the banking industry. And along that vein, in 2014, they started a pilot in the cloud. And by 2020, they had actually closed their last data center, having migrated everything into the cloud. Capital One is also a pioneer in machine learning. For example, they use their Amazon S3 data lake to improve their customer applications. So in 2016 and 2017, as they were building up their data in the cloud, they were also looking for ways to maximize their resource efficiency. One of the first things they did was enable versioning on around 90% of their buckets, which gave them disaster recovery protection, also protection against accidental deletes and updates. But they also started accruing a lot of data as they were overriding objects and building up non-current versions. So they needed a way to lower their cost and to clean up non-current versions that they no longer needed. So what they did is they used Lifecycle first to delete non-current versions after a certain period of time. And this was great, but it didn't lower their costs as much as they'd like. So they also moved non-current versions to standard and frequent access in order to save more on their storage while they were maintaining the non-current versions. And then in 2020, their audit requirements changed. And they were able to use S3 Glacier Flexible Retrieval and S3 Glacier Deep Archive. So what they did is they combed through 500 buckets, and they changed their lifecycle policies where their access requirements would allow to lifecycle petabytes of data into archive. And because they were able to move so much data, they saved dramatically on their storage that required less access. Now I want to tell you about a customer that was using LTO tape before they moved their archives to AWS. And that customer is NASCAR, or the National Association for Stock Car Auto Racing, which is the sanctioning body for the #1 form of motorsports in the United States. And as a growing media business, they were adding 1.5 to 2 petabytes of data per year. And they were running into challenges managing their LTO tapes. They had thousands of tapes. They had LTO 4 generation, LTO 6 generation tapes, as well as they were storing tapes off-site. And managing risks was becoming a problem. Things like running out of slots on their current tape library before the next generation of LTO tape came out. And so they reflected on their strategy. They realized that they could use AWS Glacier storage classes to maximize their value and also generate new insights. Now, their primary use case was high-resolution media, and still is. Before AWS, they were storing 2 copies of this data, one in an LTO library and one off-site. So they used Cloud-First's Rapid Migrate automation workflow to move petabytes of data into AWS in just over 1 year. And so the way they set this up in AWS was for their high-resolution media assets, the assets that they can't recreate and they need to be available, they used S3 Glacier Instant Retrieval after 1 day. So they lifecycled 2 Glacier Instant Retrieval, and that gave them enough access after the first day that they created it. And then because races happen about once per year per track, they noticed that after 2 years, their access fell significantly, and they no longer required that millisecond access. And so after 2 years of creation, the media assets could then be moved to S3 Glacier Deep Archive after 2 years in perpetuity. So in conclusion, NASCAR got away from managing tapes and could spend more time developing workflows that help their business. So in summary, today we've talked about why customers archive data. We've reviewed the benefits of archiving in Amazon S3, as well as the archival storage classes available to you. We've talked about lifecycle tools that you can use to help reduce your costs, including the object size filter and versioning filter. And in addition, we talked about S3 intelligent tiering, which you can use to automatically reduce your costs if your access pattern is unknown. And finally, we reviewed 2 AWS customers, Capital One and NASCAR, and looked at how they're using AWS archival storage to reduce their costs. So with that, I want to leave you with these closing thoughts. Amazon S3 helps maximize the value of your archives. It's easy to optimize your storage costs and also get access to your storage when you need it. And now with 3 archival storage classes that cover a variety of use cases, customers can get access to data within milliseconds to hours while saving with archival storage. So in conclusion, with all of the innovation happening at AWS, there's no better place in the world to archive data than Amazon S3 Glacier storage classes. Thank you so much for joining my session. And if you're interested in any of the decks you've seen here today, just scan the QR code and you can get access to them. And now I'll take questions.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. We've got some questions, I think.
Yeah, we do. Quite a few.
Want to go first?
No, how about you?
All right, I'll start. Andrew, you talked about archiving and how it's changed and kind of the new storage classes and the new improvements that Glacier's made, or S3 Glacier's made. Why is having a data archiving strategy so important?
We talked about how companies are storing petabytes of data, and that can just get really expensive if you don't have an archiving strategy. And it's much better to have an archiving strategy earlier rather than later, because you don't want to be figuring out how to reduce your storage costs when you already have petabytes of data. So with archiving, what companies can do is use that money that they're saving on the data that's rarely accessed for things that really help their business. And that's why it's so important to have an archiving strategy, because that's money that can be spent elsewhere.
Yeah, super interesting. Just to follow up on that, how does archiving AWS increase the value?
With AWS, customers can easily access their data, whether it's in the instant retrieval, flexible retrieval, or Glacier Deep Archive storage class within a given period of time. And then they can pull that into EC2 or whatever other services they're using across AWS and actually generate insights from that data. And it's so critical to be able to do that because, for example, in NASCAR's use case, there's no reason to store data that you're not going to use. You want to be able to actually pull it out and do something with it. And they saw that opportunity to move their data into AWS so they could actually generate those insights on their media files.
So 2 more questions. The launch of S3 Glacier Instant Retrieval, like the milliseconds access time, that's really different for archives. Can you talk about how different that is and how much that is I mean, I don't want to overuse the word game changing, but it seems to be that is a little bit game changing. And then after that, to save time again, your favorite pie.
It is game changing. I think that's absolutely true. And that's because customers can now get archival storage pricing on AWS and still get millisecond access for their data that's being accessed less than 4 times per year. And it was very important to many of our customers to have that access. And so we're very excited to be able to provide that to them. For example, healthcare companies, they really do need a way to store all of that long-lived data and still access it in milliseconds, but really reduce their costs because the access pattern is so seldom. And then favorite pie? BlackBerry.
Thanks, Andrew. That was a great session on archiving your data. I think that's kind of the theme of the day is of securing your data. Now it's how you use your data and different workloads and use cases for using your data.